Hello, this is a recording made for the Suffolk Jungian Circle for our second meeting. This is just a sort of a prelude to get people thinking about certain issues. Now, for our second meeting, we are looking at issues connected to the feeling personality type. So having looked at the thinking one for our very first meeting. So this is the polar opposite. Thinking and feeling are dichotomies, according to Jung, and quite a few other people as well, of course. So we'll explore some of those ideas, and I'll try to keep this recording a bit shorter than the previous one, because I think I waffled on a bit too much really for that. So the feeling type is someone who approaches the world primarily through the lens of their emotions. And just to reiterate Jung's point that we all of us have all four types. We're all capable of thinking, capable of feeling, capable of intuiting, capable of being sensation-oriented. It's just that one of them tends to dominate in most people, at least for the first 40-odd years of their lives. And it's only, Jung's argument was that you need to get to the other side of 40 in order to start developing enough life experience to be able to understand your inner workings and sort of adjust and develop yourself. I suppose you can debate the accuracy of that age group in years. Some people might think it's older, some people might think it's younger, but we'll stick to 40 for the moment as a fair enough number to work through. So it's after that age that you get to the point where you can work on your auxiliary functions, your tertiary functions, your inferior functions. So the three of the four factors that you are less developed in. So whilst everyone is capable of feeling, the feeling type person, their emotions are the most strongest, the most developed of the four approaches, and it's through the lens of their emotions that they tend to approach the world and understand the world around them. And they can do that by being an extroverted feeling type or by being an introverted feeling type. And we'll think about both of those as we go along. In terms of approaching the world through your emotions, it can be understood in a number of different ways. Perhaps the most straightforward thing to think about is the way in which we tend to relate to people and pets, animals, loved ones of one type or another. You can have an intellectual understanding for the thinking types of a person, of a subject matter. A feeling understanding of it is a much more visceral connection, a much more immediate connection, and you start to feel a link between you and them. Whereas the thinking type might have an interest in a person because they've done something, or they know about a subject, or they've got some ideas in their head that are quite interesting to know about and discuss. Sorry, take these off. The feeling person is much more interested in just having that individual present in life, not because they think a particular set of things, not because they've got a particular set of skills or they've had some special life experience that makes them super duper fascinating, but there is something about that person they bond with. They have an emotional connection to them, and even if the person changes over time, and this perhaps is a distinction between how the thinking type relates and how the feeling type relates, that whereas the thinking type is primarily interested in what's going on in somebody else's head, and you could argue perhaps that if the contents of that other person's head changes, whether they lose interest in a subject that the thinking type finds fascinating over a period of time, or the illness, Alzheimer's, dementia, perhaps the elements of them start to fade and they lose part of the contents of their head, or they have a radical change of views and suddenly they become a devout religious conversion or a radical political conversion, and they're no longer thinking about the things that to begin with interested the thinking type. Therefore they will lose interest, they will lose contact with that individual because they've no longer got the intellectual content there to draw the thinking type in. The feeling type, relates to that person as a person. So even if the contents of their mind change, they have that radical conversion, or they become ill and start to lose their memories and their knowledge and whatever else it may be that happens over time, the feeling type person still wants to be with them because it's still that person. and it is them that they have bonded with and related to, and so the connection is there. A feeling type person faced with a new situation, a new individual, meeting someone for the first time, often the first question that leaps to their mind is, how does this person, how does this experience, how does this issue make me feel? Not what do I think about it, thinking type, but how does it make me feel? What do I feel about this experience, about this person? Does it make me happy, make me sad, make me hopeful, fearful, whatever else? And the evaluation is made on that basis. Now, trying to think of examples of this to make it a bit more pragmatic. I used to know somebody years ago who worked in a laboratory, in an animal vivisection laboratory, and it's something I could never do. I mean, not aside from the fact that I don't have the qualifications and the kind of medical knowledge to do that, but I couldn't be around distressed animals and doing things to them to make them more distressed. I just couldn't do it. I'd have to leave. But her understanding of what she was doing was that it was medical research into medications and drugs and what have you, that although, yes, she knew perfectly well the animals in that laboratory were suffering and distressed, etc., etc., but she was looking to the longer-term medical advantages to human beings of having those medicines tested and then being available on the market, and she was thinking about the hundreds, thousands and millions, however many people it would be, that would benefit from the knowledge she was helping. She was only one small cog in a big machine, but she was contributing towards the overall betterment of humanity. But obviously there is that strong emotional reaction that some of us would have to being amongst people, animals, who are very distressed. For me, animals are people, but anyway, that's a good point. And even if there was that knowledge that in the longer term there would be XYZ advantages gained, and it would help this person and help that person, help some other person, the immediate dealing with distress is difficult. And you've got to have a capacity to sort of turn off, compartmentalise, I think, in order to think, yes, this dog, this monkey, this rabbit is very upset, is very distressed, it's in pain. However, I'm not going to respond to that with empathy and common feeling. I'm going to turn that bit of myself off for an hour or two or three and focus on the intellectual activity at hand of conducting the research and writing up the reports and all of that. The feeling type person, I don't think would be able to do that. Although I might be wrong. Maybe you know of people who are very much the feeling type who can compartmentalise their emotions, but I suspect the majority of feeling people would not be able to turn it off, compartmentalise their emotions and focus on some other aspect of the activity before them. They would be too overwhelmed by the sense of empathy that they feel for the whimpering puppies or the screeching monkeys, or whatever expression of distress is coming from the people before them. Now, there are areas where feeling types are often very good with distress in the medical profession. What might be called the bedside manner is a demonstration of the feeling type. So you can, obviously, I dare say many of you will have known doctors and nurses and dentists and whatnot who have absolutely no bedside manner at all. They may be really good at the more intellectual aspects of their job. Their knowledge of medicine may be second to none, and they can come in, look at a body and go, oh, XYZ is wrong with it and we need to do so-and-so treatments, and boom, respond in that way, and they give you the exact right treatment and you recover and you leave, but there's no warmth about them, there's no humanity about them. You are just a lump of meat in front of them that they are evaluating, assessing, and then they're on to the next lump of meat. And your humanity has not been recognised. So the feeling type is the bedside manner approach, is to say you are a person, you are in distress, and doesn't mean they might not also be very good at the sort of more intellectual aspects of diagnosis and treatment and so forth, but that their initial response to you is as one caring human being to another, to see your distress, your pain, your discomfort, your illness, and maybe to also understand factors like you can obviously have a patient whose behaviour is maybe making their illness worse in the first place. They've got a lung disease and they're chain smoking away, or they've got a liver disease and they're tipping booze down their throat like no one's business. And the more thinking type might be inclined to think, well, pull yourself together, stop doing this stupid activity, give it up, go on, get on with it, and be quite clinical and not understand that changing those behaviours is very, very difficult. If you've spent your lifetime eating cream cakes until you're 55 stone and you've got 101 illnesses as a result, the intellectual knowledge that your behaviour is causing your illnesses is one thing, but the capacity to change your behaviours is another thing entirely. And I think or I perceive, I should say, the feeling type person would understand that and would have more patience to work with the individual to say, look, I know it's difficult to change your drinking, I know it's difficult to change your eating habits or your smoking habits or whatever it may be. However, let's work through it. They would be very good as counsellors, as therapists. I just realised the energy on this is running low. So plug that in. So they would be quite good at that, empathising, that working with and understanding other people's emotions. Now, as we did with the thinking recording, for the thinking type person, we looked at the extrovert, the outgoing side of it, and the introvert, the inward turning side of it. The extrovert is very good at reading other people's emotions and relating to them and helping them, the other person, to understand their emotions. And I've no idea if anyone's ever done an evaluation of counsellors and therapists to see how many fall into this personality type or that personality type, but I suspect there'd probably be a lot of therapists and counsellors who would be extroverted feeling types, because part of that is the ability, whether you do it as a career or whether you just sort of do it on a more informal basis, to understand other people so well, read their body language, pick up on their emotional states, and have such a good understanding of it that you can then articulate it back to them and say, clearly you're feeling like this, clearly you're feeling like that, and you may be better at explaining their emotions than they are able to explain their own emotions sometimes, because that includes the people who are maybe a bit emotionally inarticulate, who would very much struggle to explain their emotions to somebody else. To put it, they know what they feel, but they just can't put it into words. Whereas the extrovert feeling type could put it into words and say, oh, this is what you're going through, I see that. And have sympathy for it and empathy for it. There is a difference. You could understand somebody else's emotions and not give a flying donut about them. You could be manipulative, shall we say, the classical psychopath, or antisocial personality disorder, as we're meant to call it these days, in that you can see what somebody else is going through very, very clearly. You just really don't care. Or maybe you even want to take advantage of what they're going through and manipulate them into some personal gain for yourself. So that there could be that risk there, but the extrovert feeling type is normally much better at seeing, reading, diagnosing, explaining and understanding other people's emotions as well as their own emotional states. The introverted feeling type is pretty good at seeing what others are going through as well, but is less engaged in wanting to explain to other people and to help them to articulate. So I suspect there are a lot fewer introverted feeling types in the counselling and therapy professions than there are extroverted feeling types, because there is not, with the introverted type, there is not necessarily that engagement with other people. They see it, they just don't necessarily want to make the social connections that are required in order to explain and articulate and give the overview of what the other person is going through. So there's an issue there. But they have profoundly deep feelings. One phrase that crops up a lot in the research around this is that old adage of still waters run deep. The introverted type is the still waters that run deep. They may not gush and spout their emotions all over the place, but those emotions are very, very deep. The extroverted is much more the gushy sort. And that could be simply, put a positive spin on it, that they are very to the forefront with their emotions. If they're happy, you know it. If they're sad, you know it. If they're angry, you know it. They are an open book when it comes to their emotions. It's all up front. There's no hiding their emotional states. Everyone around them knows precisely what they're feeling. On the negative spin, that could become suffocating. Their emotions become so dominating, so dramatic, so over the top, that they crush everybody else around them and drown them in the flood of their emotional states. That could become a significant problem. And on the downside, that may become an issue. There is an element with both the extrovert and introverted type of bonding, in that they do bond, say, this caring for other people that we were talking about earlier. They bond very deeply to other people. They miss other people when they are not around. They've died, they've moved away, whatever, or they're just crap at keeping in contact. I'm naming any names there, but I am thinking certain people are really crap at keeping in contact, but they won't be listening to this video, so there's no point naming names. That absence or presence is painful to the feeling type. The introverted feeling type, there is some discussion in various papers and what have you, has a potential on the negative, the downside, to become a bit obsessive in those connections. It's the kind of at the mild end, it's like the beginning stages of being a bit of a stalker, of obsessing over somebody else, of having such a strong bond to them that you need to be with them. You need to know what's going on in their lives. It can become quite prying, quite intrusive, especially if the other person doesn't either, like a celebrity with stalkers, has no idea you exist, but you're mad obsessed with them, or they do know you exist and they're not really that interested. They don't want that kind of a connection to you. The sort of unrequited love element can come into it quite often, of someone where the introverted feeling person has way more intense feelings for Mr. or Miss X than Mr. or Miss X reciprocates towards them. And indeed they may be quite unaware that the introvert has these feelings, because the introvert, unlike the extrovert, as I said, isn't sort of gushing their emotions all over the place. If the extrovert feeling type really, really liked you or really, really hated you, you'd probably know that, because they're not very good at hiding their feelings. It's all up front. But you might not necessarily know with that still waters run deep type that they have these intense feelings of love or hate or whatever for you. And it could go either way. It could be the sort of obsessive love, very equally it could be the obsessive hate for a particular individual that maybe builds and builds over many years, and one day they go and do something quite dreadful as a result of this intense build-up of emotion. So it can manifest in either sort of a way. The extrovert is often spoken of as being very good at things like diplomacy, negotiation, because they're so good at reading other people. They're very empathic. They can rapidly assess a situation to work out what other people are feeling and respond in an appropriate way. Sometimes, on the downside, you've got a loss of boundary, and that is a big issue perhaps with the feeling type. If we're going back to the alchemical roots of Jung's ideas, with the association with the four elements and the Greek ideas from Empedocles, the feeling type is water, and water, well, whilst frozen water can take on shape, obviously, ice, melted water, unfrozen water, is liquid. It takes on the form of whatever is around it. You pour it into a bucket, it takes the shape of the bucket. You pour it into a vase, it takes the shape of the vase. There is a sort of a chameleon element to the feeling type, where they can take on the shape of whoever or whatever is around them to fit in with their needs of the situation, and they become what they are required to become, and that can potentially lead to a loss of identity, where a person is what somebody else wants them to be rather than what they themselves want to be. And they just sort of fit in. And of course, if the other person, the one providing the shape, if they wander off, fall under a bus, do whatever they do, they cease to be around, the feeling type can go into a state of a panic, because the thing, the individual giving them shape and form, is no longer there. And what are they if they're not fitting in with that other person and shifting like a chameleon to adapt to the needs and the requirements of the other person around them? I'm reminded a little bit of, was it Deep Space Nine with Odo, the alien who was a shape-shifting creature who looked humanish during the day, but at night reverted to a liquid form and slept in a bucket, I think it was, if I remember rightly. Just turned into this blob when not maintaining a shape during the waking hours. That some people, when they're not around the thing giving them form, they feel panic. They feel, oh, I've lost my identity, I've lost my sense of who I am, because I've always been this thing for somebody else. And that bringing out the feeling element. There was a comedy sitcom going back to, was it the 80s, I think, around about then, 70s, 80s, something like that, featuring Ronnie Corbett, called Sorry, in which he played a librarian who still lived at home with mum and dad. And the mother was this sort of right old dragon who, even though he was whatever age he was at the time, 30s, 40s or something, the mother kept treating him like he was 5 years old. Indeed, she treated everybody like they were 5 years old. And towards the end of the series, after however many episodes it was, he finally gets a girlfriend and moves out, and the mother goes into meltdown because she cannot conceive of who she is if she is not constantly mothering a child. And she ends up getting a lodger, and she treats the lodger like her replacement child. So she keeps maintaining her form by, effectively, I suppose, finding a new bucket to go into and maintain the shape that she is used to. She cannot imagine being anything other than a mother, anything other than nurturing and caring in this really smothering, domineering, suffocating sort of a way, where she's got someone perpetually tied to her apron strings and dependent. And that perhaps is an element with the feeling type as well as with the great mother archetype, which is a discussion for another day, that in nurturing others, which is a strong role of both the extrovert and the introvert type, the wish to nurture, it's very easy to nurture someone who is dependent on you, who's needy. But what happens if they grow strong, they grow independent, they no longer need you in the same way, they're no longer there every 5 minutes, they fly the nest? Who do you nurture when they're not around? Now, see, some people have a career where, nursing, doctoring, whatever, where when one patient goes, there's another patient 3 seconds later, so there's a perpetual, always someone in a state of need, which maybe is a career option for the individuals with this personality type, to go into something where they are constantly needed and they're constantly able to nurture. Not necessarily, though, a long-term healthy strategy, because as per Jung's bit about getting to the age of 40 and then trying to develop your other traits, in developing your other traits, you de facto pay less attention to your most dominant trait, less time doing that thing and more time doing other things. So you would have to get to a stage in your life where, even though you're really, really, really good at nurturing, you'd have to step back from it a bit and say, right, I'm done with the nurturing, I need to focus on these other bits of me that are undeveloped. And that could be a really difficult challenge for someone whose entire sense of self is shaped by the needs of other people. The needs of other people are the bucket, vase, whatever you want to call it, into which the more liquid, boundary-less feeling type has slotted. And there can be a real problem with empathy. Is generally speaking a good thing, but an excess of empathy can lead to an inability to tell where I end and you begin. That it's a very common reaction, isn't it? Somebody starts laughing and you've got no idea what they're laughing at, but you begin to laugh as well. Or they burst into tears and you've got no idea what they're upset about, but you start to feel a bit tearful as well. We have this mirror neuron function in our brain where we see the emotions of others, and most of us, not all of us, most of us, will tend to start replicating, imitating the emotions, mirroring the emotions we see in other people, even if we don't know what the actual cause of the laughter or the sadness or whatever it is happens to be. Emotion is contagious in all sorts of ways. I was reading quite an interesting study the other day on sociogenic illness. The notion that it was talking mostly about TikTok, but I'm sure it applies to other forms of platform online activity as well, not just TikTok. But this tendency for people to go onto social media, and they have a group of friends, and one person in the group of friends says, "Oh, I've just been diagnosed with so-and-so illness." Then a lot, not all, but a lot of the other people in the circle of friends can start to go, "Oh, I think I've got that too." And you get this sort of mirroring of somebody else's illness. The research suggested that of all of the various demographics of people, the group in which this is the commonest pattern to crop up are teenage girls. Sometimes teenage boys as well, but especially teenage girls. When you've got a friendship circle of girls online, one of them has an issue, they all start to get the issue. One of them says, "Oh, I'm depressed, I've got anorexia, I've got multiple personality disorder, this, that, the other thing," and the rest self-diagnosed. And this was the important part of the study, was that they were not diagnosed by a doctor with genuine symptoms. Maybe the first girl was, but the rest of them weren't. They were just convincing themselves in their own head that if their friend Sally had this illness, they must have it too. And they'd see her talk about her symptoms on TikTok or whatever, and then they'd replicate, not as a conscious lie, but as a sort of a subconscious imitation. And the suggestion was that this is partially, at least, a desire for attention, a desire to fit in, and that's an issue with the feeding types. It's about tribe and bonding and creating family, creating togetherness. Humanity wouldn't survive for 20 million years if we had not been capable of bonding together and wanting to be part of a group, part of a tribe, wanting to be like the other people around us. So they start expressing a certain set of opinions. We follow similar political views, similar religious views, similar culinary tastes. Or they're all eating this, I'll start eating that as well. They're all wearing these clothings, I'll start wearing those clothes too. We want to fit in and be part of a group, which is why, of course, you get fashion subgenres like goths and emos and so on, where one of them wears a certain set of things, and then the others want to wear the same fashions, listen to the same music, read the same literature, hang out at the same places. That desire to imitate and fit in. It's a standard human response, and that, you could argue, I think Jung would certainly argue, is the feeling function coming to the fore. I have bonded with that person over there, therefore I want to start dressing like them, eating like them, socialising at the same places that they go to, espousing the same views, listening to the same music. I want to be like them. It's that chameleon fitting in. Now, whether that lasts 6 months, 6 years, 60 years, depends on the person and the circumstances. But that wish to be like others is a human survival drive. And it's part of this state. The introverted feeling type is perhaps a little bit more standoffish and less likely to imitate, less likely to be swept up by other people's emotions, but will be very aware of them, very good at reading them, very good at engaging with them, if they choose to. But being introverted, they might not choose to in the first place. They might just sort of look from a distance and reflect, but not want to get drawn too far into social engagement with other people and their problems and their hang-ups. Going back to the alchemical thing, I mentioned water. There is an association with the West when it comes to the 4 cardinal points. Water is associated with the West, which is where the sun goes down, and in many cultures, like the Egyptian, as a primary example, ancient Egyptian that is associated with the dead, because the sun goes down, and that's where the souls of the dead go down, where there's the same place that the sun goes down. And I wonder if that's an element, I'm not going to suggest much more than just what I've said just now, but perhaps something we can discuss in group, that sensitivity, what is clairvoyance, mediumship? Is it not partially a response to an understanding of the needs of the other people? Which I'm not saying it's all cold reading, but there is an element of reading the client, the person in the room, and understanding them and responding to them. And perhaps, I do believe in ancestral spirits, and not everyone does clearly, but I do. The intuition and the ability to read is not just maybe always confined to the living or always confined to humans. Sometimes it maybe can extend to the dead, extend to the non-human, like the animal experimentation example I mentioned earlier. So as well as being very nurturing towards the humans, they could be just as good as a vet, looking after animals, or working in a dog sanctuary or a cat sanctuary or whatever, and responding to the needs of the non-human as well as responding to the needs of the human, and maybe responding to the needs of the non-living as well as to the living. Maybe. But we can explore that idea both in terms of the sort of mediumship element, but also I think kind of an interest in the dead, in history, and looking at old bones and broken pots from 1,000 years ago, and other remains, and being able to read the human story into the earthly remains of past generations. And so I suspect there would be a great passion for recreating the stories because of picking up on the human element, and that's very much what the feeling function is about, picking up on the human element, seeing other people, as humans, and responding to that and intuiting that. So someone with a very undeveloped feeling function might really struggle to relate to other living persons as human, as people. They might see them more as things. You go into a shop, the person behind the counter, the cashier, do you just treat them as this sort of thing, a thing? You give them a product and some money, and they tap a few buttons and give you a change back, and you don't need to have any greater understanding of them than they do their job, thank you very much, goodbye? Or do you see that as another human being who may be having a good day or a bad day or whatever else, and so you respond to that cashier as a human, as a person, rather than just as a function? Because the undeveloped feeling quality would tend to treat other people as functions. You do a job, I don't have to think about you beyond your job, just get on with it, do the function. That's all you exist as in my life, the provider of a function, and you either do that function really well or you do it badly. But that's it, that's the limits of what I need to understand about you. The feeling function, which is very developed, would see them as people, see them and engage with them as human beings. And you could argue, maybe something we can explore in the discussion, that a lot of this kind of civil rights end of things, for some, I'm not saying for everybody involved in it, because of a mix of motivations, but for a sizable portion of the people who get involved in civil rights and those sorts of movements, are, especially if they are coming from outside the group, so in other words, white people who participated back in the 60s in the civil rights protests for black people, who are coming from an outside perspective, what these days I suppose would be called an ally, are in doing that, they are recognising the humanity in a group of people who their culture has encouraged them to think of as being sort of less than human. That you don't have to think about them, they're the wrong ethnicity, the wrong religion, the wrong sexuality, the wrong whatever. They're not real people like us, or days of ancient Rome, and well, many other cultures have had slaves, still do have slaves in some parts of the world. The slave is not a human being, they're a function. And you give no more thought to them than you would give to a washing machine or an oven. It's just an object that serves a function. You don't sort of sit there and think, I wonder what my tumble dryer is feeling like today. I wonder if my tumble dryer gets on well with the oven. Do they like each other? I'm not sure. That would be a really weird conversation to have, or a really weird thought process to have. And I suspect in slave-owning cultures, the owners think of the slaves or don't think of the slaves, more to the point, in that kind of way. They're not looking at them necessarily as human beings, they're looking at them as objects that serve a function. And it's broken, you don't sit there and weep and wail because your washing machine is broken, you chuck it out and buy another one. It's a replaceable article. And in slave-owning cultures, slaves are replaceable articles. So if one of them gets ill or they die or whatever, they're not necessarily thought of in the way you'd think of as another human being, or somebody in your mind that you identify as another fully fledged human being. You think of the slave as a sort of a lesser human being. So in a lot of those cultures, I suggest the feeling function is maybe quite often undeveloped, in that there is a cultural push to treat certain groups of humans as not really human at all, and not worthy of the mental processes involved in seeing them as human, and it's pushed in that way. And there will be always in those communities groups of people who buck the trend, who don't think like that, who do look upon a slave or somebody from a different ethnic group or a different religious group or whatever as very much a human being, and don't understand why the other people around them have such horrible attitudes, and maybe they become part of protest movements and so on. But there is an element of that, to which point you bond to somebody else and are capable of recognising them as human, as a person. And the feeling function, I would suggest, is a prominent element of that. But how are we doing for time? Okay, I've waffled on as much as I want to waffle on for, I think. So if I finish it there, and we can perhaps have these as discussion points in the group chat in whenever it is, the end of the month. And if you've got any comments to make, and this also comments, obviously you don't have to be a member of the Suffolk Jungian Circle to make comments, you might be just listening to this generally and want to make a few points, please do. More than welcome. Thank you.